Hey, it's Dan here. Today I'm talking about some fundamental principles and guiding philosophies to help you quickly progress through your EQ decisions. It should be stated that this video won't be covering specific settings like boost X frequency by 3 dB on Y instrument, but instead I'd like to arm you with an underlying thought process or philosophy which allows you to achieve the sounds you're after based on your own taste and creativity. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that you have subjectively good sounding studio monitors or headphones and have had experience with the uses of basic EQ processes and understand some of the terminology associated with it. Before we begin, I suggest checking out my spectral management video as it will provide an overall context for the following information to fit into. It is usually good preparation to clean up an instrument using high or low pass filters before you delve deeper into your EQ settings, as sometimes this is enough to get the sound you're after. High pass instruments, when low information may not be needed or is not critical to the mix, such as keys, flute, guitar, backing vocals, lead vocals, etc. This allows the bass instruments of your mix full reign of the available low end without having to fight for space. Try and cut only what is unnecessary for your sound. Low pass when you require an instrument to play a supportive role in the mix, that is, to sit back or lack some top end presence, or to simply tighten it up. As always, there are exceptions. Joe Barresi has produced some of the most amazing rock guitar sounds, and despite current wisdom saying that you should high pass almost everything that is not contributing to the low end, Joe recommends never to high pass your rock guitars. A mastering engineer once told me that he believed that putting a low-pass filter on an instrument was potentially removing the upper harmonics of the sound, many of which could not be heard, but perhaps nevertheless still perceived as having an effect on those further down the line at the low end of the frequency scale. One all-time guiding philosophy by which many engineers live by is the wide boost, narrow cut approach to EQ. It is all about retaining the natural character of the sound. I'll briefly explain. Wide boosts are recommended due to their natural sound, as narrow boosts tend to hype up small bands of the spectrum for which our ears quickly identify as unnatural harmonic balances for a given instrument or severe timbral changes. When cutting, it is recommended that they be narrow so as not to take away so much of the audio and remove too much character from the instrument. Cutting also tends to be inaudible to our ears, allowing us to remove any problems without a noticeable change to the sound. One thing I'd like to add to this is that we sometimes need to make something sound a bit unnatural or nasty in order to make it cut through the mix, such as a vocal or bass guitar, and this is where a narrow boost may serve this purpose better than a wide boost. Also, I believe there is possibly an exception to this school of thought when it comes to things like drum sounds, as they don't tend to move around like melodic instruments do. Due to their static and consistent nature, we can afford to experiment with narrower boosts and wider cuts, without as much risk of overemphasizing or unbalancing the spectrum on these instruments. This is Subtractive This is additive. These two EQ methods could logically be seen as simple opposite functions of one another, when in fact there are some subtle and important differences which set them apart. Subtractive EQ is used to conceal the aspects of a sound of which we find unappealing, and in doing so, we do not actually affect the volume level too much when we cut away from the original sound. Subtractive EQ does not affect the timbre in as much as it simply conceals parts of the original sound and therefore has less effect on the timbre. Additive EQ, however, will add almost the same amount of decibels to a track as the collective boosts, more so for bass boosts, and also change the timbre of the instrument and colour the sound with the equalizer we are using. Put another way, we are either adding something new to enhance the original sound, or we are taking away from the original sound. I believed for many years that a boost was an equal and opposite function to that of making a cut. In reality though, additive and subtractive are very much different approaches to processing the signal. For instance, if you think of the process of EQ like this picture, if I add colour to this picture, it is arguably more noticeable than if I simply conceal the flaws. So, when you're crafting your sound with your EQ, ask yourself this question. Do I want to enhance the tone or timbre of the sound, or do I want to hide its flaws? Your answer to this question will determine how you proceed with your EQ. It's never simply a question of which way you should go, as the answer could be, I want to do a bit of both. I want to conceal the mistakes and make it sound warmer, fuller, brighter, etc., etc. Personally, I prefer to clean up the sound before I colour it with additive EQ, which is where notch filtering can come into play, a form of focused subtractive EQ. First, identify areas on the spectrum where frequencies are bugging you, then drop the overall level of the track by 10 or more decibels. Now boost a single band of EQ in the area where you perceive the problem to be, and narrow the EQ so that it focuses on a smaller chunk of the spectrum. You are listening for frequencies which are resonant, woofy, piercing, whistling, boomy, muddy, etc. They are annoying frequencies which you will have to train your ears to hear over time without boosting an EQ band to hear them. And I assure you that the more you practice this technique of EQing, the more adept at hearing these problems you will become. At this point, you have pinpointed the problem, the sound of which will be burned into your brain. How much you lessen the problem frequency is really a question of taste and balance. What you are generally trying to do is reduce the severity of that one frequency and bring it back in line with the rest of the sound. That is, to readdress the balance, not to necessarily cut it out completely though. At this point, however, we have likely lost some perspective, and will tend to think the problem is actually worse than it is in reality. This, of course, results in an overuse of EQ cuts, which can take away and degrade the character of the original sound. Take a moment and let your ears readjust, and then play back the audio with the EQ bypassed. Take a moment and let your ears readjust, and then play back the audio with the EQ engaged, and make a judgment as to whether you have improved the sound or not. Let your taste guide you to further reduce or boost the gain as necessary until you find the appropriate balance. You still may struggle to find the sound you want. Why not take a leaf out of George Costanza's philosophy book and do the opposite? And before you know it, you'll be in a better job with a beautiful girlfriend, living a full and happy, successful life, just by simply ignoring your natural logical instincts. You might be listening to your mix thinking, geez, that guitar is really brittle. I probably should remove the top end of the track to alleviate this problem, which happens to be essentially a wide cut. This can be the case, for example, with DI'd acoustic guitars. So you go ahead and whack a low pass filter over it, expecting it to sound better, but instead you find that it's now really dull or lifeless. It lacks the character of the original sound. It's at this point you decide to back it off a little and find that the sound is still dull and still a little brittle as it was before. Take stock at this point of the terminology with which you identify the sound, brittle and dull. This is important, thinking back to our earlier question, do I want to change the timbre or hide its flaws? In this case, you want to do both of these things, but are they separate problems or one and the same in this case? To make the sound less brittle, you also made it dull. This points to a different issue altogether. Before you sweep around to do loads of notch filtering, try doing the opposite. Rather than cutting the highs, try boosting the low end. Masking occurs when a louder sound, or in this case frequency, covers up a quieter sound. This is truer for lower frequencies than it is for higher frequencies, due to the fact that the low end frequencies require more power and there's only so much to go around. Now usually it's undesirable to have any masking occurring in your mixes. It's what can cause a mix to muddy up easily, except in this case where we wish to conceal the flaws within a single isolated instrument. So by boosting the low end, we mask the brittleness of the top end, without consequently making it dull. If we remember the photo from earlier, I guess it's a little like tinting the photo to conceal the flaws. They are still present, but are less noticeable. Now say for example you're like me, you love to use compression on certain instruments. You discern for instance that the bass guitar in your mix is destined to have some sort of compression added to it. You may even have an instinct for the type of settings you're likely to use. So a typical approach for working with compressed tracks might be that you have your subtractive EQ first, your compressor, and then your additive EQ. Subtractive to remove the problems before the compressor, additive to enhance the sound without adding to the compression by having it hit the track harder, as would be the case before the compressor. Here's the thing though, if you add compression to an already EQ'd balanced track, chances are that the compression will likely change the tonal balance in some way. It depends on the compressor of course, as some compressors change audio tone drastically, others subtly. I used to find that a lot of the time I'd go up and clean my audio with subtractive EQ, put a compressor on after that, and subsequently find that the compressor brought up more problems to fix, meaning more processing. Not ideal. The subtractive decisions I had made prior to the compressor were no longer relevant. So I quickly learnt that I was actually better off leaving the EQ blank. What I like to do after the blank EQ is in place, before the compressor, is then go back to subtractively EQ out the frequencies that were undesirable or brought up through the side effects of compression. It can save you so much time, and you also don't end up further degrading the audio with any unnecessary additional processing by adding more EQ to the track. This takes an early commitment to the compressor settings into which we are EQing out any problems as we listen through the compressor, and then we can tone the audio with EQ boosts after the compressor if necessary. At the end of the day, however, you must have a purpose to EQ, apart from just wanting to appear busy. Changing the sound with any processing should be avoided if you can help it. I believe that we should ideally endeavour to attain the sounds we want at the source. That is, by recording a skilled musician who delivers a great performance with a correctly balanced and tonally adjusted instrument, with the appropriate microphones, in the ideal positions in the right room. Aim to record your tracks so well that they don't need any processing at all, for in the end, the best EQ will be no EQ. So there you have it. Hopefully this gives you the skills and confidence to approach EQing any instrument. I'd like to give a big shout out to my mate Lee Young, who put together the intro. He's a 3D motion graphics designer and a very talented one, and also a very talented musician. So a big thank you to him. Until next time, happy mixing. If you have any questions, comments or ideas for new video tutorials, please email me at yamahadrums2009@hotmail.com, and please subscribe to remain informed of video updates.